Major Ernst Ritter filed a report on January 4, 1945, that his own regimental commander initially returned to him with a note in the margin asking whether it had been written under duress. It had not. Ritter wrote it sober, in full possession of his faculties, describing 8 escaped American prisoners of war who had, in the space of 19 days, destroyed a fuel depot, ambushed 2 supply columns at a critical communications line 3 separate times, and killed or wounded, by his own conservative tally, more than 40 German soldiers assigned to the considerable manhunt organized specifically to recapture them. I was ordered to find 8 unarmed men who had walked away from a transport column with nothing but the clothes on their backs, Ritter wrote. I have instead spent 19 days fighting a small war against an enemy that appears to have armed, organized, and deployed itself entirely from what it could take from us. I do not know how to characterize this development in a manner my superiors will find militarily reassuring, so I will simply describe what occurred and allow the facts to speak for themselves. Ritter was a security officer, not a combat commander in the conventional sense, a man whose career had been built managing prisoner transports, rear area logistics, and the unglamorous but essential machinery that kept a modern army supply lines functioning. He had never expected, and by his own account, never particularly wanted, to be tested in the way the next 3 weeks would test him. He had spent 2 years overseeing prisoner movements across occupied France, and in that time had developed what he considered a thorough, professional understanding of what escaped prisoners typically did and typically did not do. Most escapees, in his experience, ran. They sought civilian clothing, tried to make contact with resistance networks if any existed in the area, and above all attempted to put distance between themselves and any German unit as quickly as possible, moving toward Allied lines by the most direct and least confrontational route available. This was, in Ritter's professional judgment, entirely rational behavior for unarmed men deep in hostile territory with no equipment and no realistic prospect of engaging a modern army in anything resembling a fight. The 8 men who walked away from his transport column on the night of December 16th, during the chaos of the opening hours of the German Ardennes offensive, did not behave this way. Ritter would spend the following 3 weeks trying, and largely failing, to understand why. The 8 men had almost nothing in common when the war put them together. They came from 4 different American infantry and armored units, captured separately over the course of several weeks during the fighting retreat that preceded the Ardennes offensive, and had been thrown together only by the administrative logic of a prisoner transport column that grouped captives by geography rather than unit. Staff Sergeant Everett Doyle, the senior man among them, had been a tank commander before his vehicle was destroyed, and he was captured, wounded, outside a Belgian crossroads town 3 weeks earlier. Corporal Nathaniel Osai, a combat engineer from Georgia, had extensive experience with demolitions, a fact that would prove, in the weeks ahead, considerably more relevant than anyone organizing the transport column could have anticipated. Private First Class Tomas Kowalczyk, barely 19, had been a rifleman for less than 2 months before his capture. The others, Private Harley's Ward, Corporal Sam Rutledge, Private First Class Aldo Bianchi, Sergeant Curtis Vance, and Private Otis Freeman, brought between them a scattering of skills. A former hunting guide's tracking sense, a mechanic's practical knowledge of vehicles and engines, a signals corpsman's understanding of German communications equipment, and in Vance's case, several months of experience as a squad leader that had earned him, even among men who had known him only a matter of weeks, the kind of quiet deference that develops around soldiers who make good decisions under pressure. What united them, according to the account later reconstructed from debriefings conducted after their eventual return to Allied lines, was less any shared skill than a shared and specific frustration, the sense, articulated most directly by Doyle in his own post-war account, that captivity itself represented a kind of surrender their training had never actually prepared them to accept gracefully. None of us signed up to be prisoners, Doyle said in an interview conducted years later. Wasn't a thing anybody trained us for, not really how to just sit there and be marched somewhere and wait for the war to happen to somebody else. When the column got hit that night and the guards scattered, wasn't really a debate among us. We went. Didn't have a plan beyond going. Plan came later, and it came because Vance, mostly, made us sit down and actually think instead of just running blind. The escape itself occurred almost by accident. The transport column, moving a group of roughly 60 prisoners toward a rear area holding facility, was caught in the opening artillery bombardment of the German offensive on the night of December 16th, its guards scattered by shells that had nothing to do with the prisoners at all. In the confusion, the 8 men who would become, in Ritter's later description, a small war unto themselves, simply walked into the tree line at the edge of the road and kept walking. What made the difference, according to Vance's own account, was a decision made within the first hour of their freedom, before any of them had eaten, before any of them had a weapon, while they were still simply 8 cold and disoriented men in a dark forest with no clear idea what came next. Vance got us to stop running long enough to actually talk. Osai recalled, said if we just tried to walk to the American lines, through country crawling with German units moving up for this offensive everybody could tell was happening, we'd be caught or dead inside 2 days. Said our best shot, strange as it sounded, wasn't running away from the Germans. It was making the Germans spend so much time and so many men trying to find us that it actually mattered to the war going on around us. Didn't sound like much of a plan at first, turned out to be a pretty good one. The group's first 3 days were spent simply surviving moving at night, avoiding roads, sheltering in an abandoned hunting lodge that Ward, drawing on his pre-war experience, identified as defensible and unlikely to be searched given the chaos of the broader German offensive unfolding around them. Their transformation from fugitives into something closer to a functioning combat unit began on the night of December 19th, when the group ambushed a 2-man German motorcycle patrol that had stopped, by pure misfortune, within sight of their position. The engagement, if it can be called that, lasted less than 30 seconds. Vance and Rutledge overpowering the 2 riders before either could raise an alarm, but it provided the group with its first weapons: 2 rifles, a pistol, and critically, a motorcycle that Bianchi, drawing on his mechanic's background, would spend the following 2 days carefully concealing and maintaining rather than risking its use on roads that were certain to be patrolled. Ritter's report notes the missing patrol with the clinical brevity of a man who did not yet understand what he was documenting. 2-man motorcycle patrol failed to report at scheduled interval on the night of December 19th. Search of the area produced no results, assessed as likely lost to partisan activity or Allied advance elements, no connection to escaped prisoners suspected at this time. The group's first significant operation came 4 days later, when Osai's engineering background and a stroke of reconnaissance luck Ward, scouting the surrounding area on foot, had located a poorly guarded fuel depot supporting the German offensive's logistics, combined to produce an attack considerably more ambitious than anything the group had previously attempted, using explosives improvised from materials scavenged over the preceding days, supplemented by ordnance recovered from an abandoned German ammunition cache Ward had also located. Osai constructed a series of charges that destroyed the majority of the depot's fuel stores in a coordinated demolition that the group executed with only 2 rifles and a pistol between them for security. The German after-action report on the incident, filed by the depot security officer, Lieutenant Karl Mannheim, describes an attack that his own investigation could not initially attribute to any known partisan cell operating in the area. The depot was destroyed by what appears to have been a small, highly competent demolition team operating with limited but effective armament. Local partisan networks in this sector have not previously demonstrated this level of technical proficiency with explosives. I recommend this incident be investigated as a distinct and possibly more significant threat than routine partisan activity. Ritter's own investigation, conducted in the days following, would eventually connect the depot's destruction to the missing motorcycle patrol, and from there to the 8 missing American prisoners, whose absence from the transport column's final headcount had, in the chaos of the offensive's opening days, gone largely unremarked until that point. The group's operations escalated further on December 28th, when they ambushed a German supply column moving through a narrow forest road, destroying 2 trucks and their cargo before withdrawing without contact and engagement notable, according to the German report filed afterward. less for its material cost than for the precision with which it had clearly been planned. Feldwebel Hans Brandt, the column's senior surviving NCO, wrote in his own account, "The ambush was positioned with clear knowledge of our route and schedule, information that should not have been available to any partisan group operating without access to German logistics planning. Charges were placed with evident technical skill. The attackers withdrew in good order, leaving no trace that our subsequent search could exploit. This does not resemble the partisan activity this sector has previously experienced." What Brandt did not know, and what Ritter would only piece together later, was that the group's intelligence on German movements came not from any external source, but from Vance's own careful, patient observation hours spent, over days, simply watching German traffic patterns from concealed positions, building a working knowledge of routes and schedules through nothing more sophisticated than sustained attention and the accumulated tracking instincts Ward brought from his pre-war work. By the new year, Ritter's manhunt had grown to include several hundred men diverted from the broader offensive to search specifically for the group, a diversion of resources that Ritter himself would later acknowledge, in his private correspondence, as disproportionate to the actual military threat. 8 men could reasonably be expected to pose, and precisely for that reason, deeply embarrassing to explain up the chain of command. The group's response to this escalating pressure was not to go to ground, as any conventional assessment would have predicted, but to escalate their own operations. On January 1st, they cut a critical communications line supporting German coordination in the sector, a line that Vance's careful reconnaissance had identified as running through a narrow, poorly guarded stretch of forest that German security had assessed as low risk precisely because of its remoteness. Ritter's report on the incident captures, more clearly than perhaps any other document in the surviving record, the particular quality of frustration the group had begun to inspire in the men assigned to stop them. This is the 3rd disruption to this communications route in 9 days. Each incident has been executed with evident advanced knowledge of patrol schedules and repair timelines, suggesting either significant intelligence support, which our own investigation has found no evidence of, or a level of patient observation and planning that I confess I did not expect from 8 unarmed escaped prisoners with no external support network. I am increasingly of the view that these men should be assessed not as escapees attempting to reach friendly lines, but as a deliberately operating combat element that has, in effect, declared and is conducting its own independent campaign against our logistics in this sector. The engagement that produced Ritter's remarkable report came on the night of January 3rd into the early hours of January 4th, when a security patrol specifically tasked with locating the group's base finally succeeded, cornering them in the hunting lodge that had sheltered them since their first days of freedom. What followed was, by any measure, an engagement the 8 men should not have survived. Ritter had committed a reinforced platoon, more than 30 men, against a position held by 8 lightly armed fugitives who had, by that point, accumulated only a modest cache of weapons and ammunition through nearly 3 weeks of scavenging and small-scale ambush. They held the lodge for just over 2 hours, according to both American and German accounts, before withdrawing under cover of darkness through a route Ward had identified and prepared days earlier, specifically anticipating that their position might eventually be located. Doyle, in a decision several of the other men would later describe as characteristic of his leadership throughout the ordeal, remained behind alone for the final 15 minutes of the engagement, maintaining fire from multiple positions to create the impression of a larger defending force and allow the others time to reach the escape route before he himself withdrew. Ritter's report describes the aftermath with an unusual note of something close to professional respect. The position was abandoned by the time our forces secured it, the defenders having withdrawn through a route our search had not previously identified, despite having inflicted, by conservative estimate, casualties equal to roughly a quarter of the committed force. I do not believe 8 men accomplished this through luck alone. I believe we encountered, over the course of 19 days, a genuinely capable small combat element that emerged, essentially from nothing, out of 8 prisoners who declined to accept that captivity was the end of their war. The group crossed into Allied lines 4 days later, On January 8th, all 8 men accounted for, 3 wounded, but none critically. Sergeant Curtis Vance, whose planning and reconnaissance had shaped nearly every operation the group conducted, was 24 years old, a former squad leader from rural Missouri, who had, according to the other 7 men's later accounts, a manner of quiet, unhurried thinking that none of them had fully appreciated until circumstances forced them to rely on it completely. Asked years later what had allowed him to think so clearly in the group's first disorienting hours of freedom, when panic or blind flight would have been, by his own admission, the more natural response, Vance offered an answer notable for its plainness. Wasn't thinking clearly, not really, not at first. Was scared same as everybody else. Just figured somebody needed to say out loud what running blind was actually likely to get us. And once I said it, seemed like the rest of the fellas were relieved somebody had. Wasn't bravery. Was just math, mostly thinking through what running actually looked like against what staying and being useful looked like, and deciding the second one gave us better odds. Corporal Nathaniel Osai, the demolitions expert whose technical skill made the fuel depot operation possible, described his own role in more modest terms when interviewed decades later. Wasn't doing anything I hadn't been trained to do already, just doing it with less equipment and considerably more improvising than the Army ever taught me to expect. Funny thing about training, you don't always know what you actually learned until you're doing it with half the tools and none of the supervision, and it turns out you learned it anyway. Private First Class Tomas Kowalczyk, the youngest of the 8, gave what may be the simplest account of the entire ordeal in a brief interview conducted shortly after the group's return to Allied lines. Was scared the whole time, if I'm honest. Never stopped being scared, but everybody else kept doing their job scared, so I figured I could too. Guess that's most of what held us together when I really think it through. Wasn't that none of us were afraid? Was that nobody let being afraid be the thing that decided what we did next? The assessment that traveled furthest through the German chain of command came from General Major Otto Rieneck, the divisional commander whose rear area security Ritter ultimately answered to, who included an extended discussion of the incident in a post-war analysis of partisan and irregular activity during the Ardennes campaign. I've reviewed the file on the 8 escaped Americans with considerable professional interest. Rieneck wrote, in part because it represents, in my experience, an almost unique case study in how quickly a group of men with no prior tactical relationship, no equipment, and no external support can constitute themselves into an effective irregular combat element given sufficient motivation, and evidently, sufficient competent leadership from within their own ranks. I do not believe this outcome was foreseeable through any assessment available to us at the time. Prisoners of war, in my professional experience across 4 years of this conflict, overwhelmingly prioritize survival and escape to friendly territory over any form of continued resistance. What we encountered instead was 8 men who appear to have concluded, collectively and apparently without extensive debate, that their obligations as soldiers did not end simply because their circumstances had changed. He continues, in a passage later cited in post-war studies of the incident, Major Ritter ultimately committed resources considerably disproportionate to the objective military threat these 8 men represented, and I do not fault him for this decision, because I believe I would have made the same choice in his position. There is a particular cost, difficult to quantify in any conventional military accounting, to permitting a small group of enemy combatants to operate with apparent impunity within one's own rear area during a critical offensive. Whatever the material damage these 8 men inflicted, and it was not insignificant, I believe the more lasting cost was the demonstration, to every German soldier who became aware of the situation, that captivity did not necessarily mean an American soldier's war was over. I do not know how one measures the cost of that particular lesson. I suspect it was considerable. All 8 men survived the war. They scattered, in the years that followed, back into the ordinary American lives. The conflict had interrupted Doyle to a small engineering firm in the Midwest, Osai to a construction career in Georgia, Kowalczyk, eventually, to a quiet life, running a hardware store in the same Pennsylvania town he'd grown up in. They held, according to several accounts gathered decades later, an informal reunion every 5 years for the remainder of their lives, a tradition that began almost by accident when Doyle and Vance found themselves, quite unplanned, in the same city for a veterans event in 1950, and simply decided, over a long evening of conversation, that the arrangement should continue. Vance, interviewed near the end of his life for a regional oral history project, was asked what he believed the 19 days in the forest had actually meant, looking back across the decades that followed. He considered the question for some time before answering, in the same unhurried manner that had, decades earlier, held 8 frightened men together in a dark forest long enough to turn fear into a plan. Wasn't about proving anything to the Germans, whatever it might have looked like from their side, he said. Wasn't really about the war in the end, not the way people probably want to hear it. Was about 8 men who found out, mostly by accident, what they were capable of together that none of us would have guessed at alone. I've thought about those 19 days more than about near anything else that happened to me in that war, and I've come around to believing the reason isn't the fighting. It's that I found out, in a cold forest with nothing but what we could scavenge, and each other, exactly what kind of man I wanted to be when everything easy had already been taken away. Don't get many chances in a life to learn that about yourself quite so plainly. I count myself lucky, strange as that sounds, that I got mine. Major Ridder, for his part, survived the war as well, and in a brief post-war correspondence with an American military historian researching the incident, offered a final assessment that closed, in its own way, the story his own report had opened weeks earlier in the cold January of 1945. I was sent to recapture 8 unarmed men, he wrote. I came away from the experience with a considerably revised understanding of what the word unarmed actually means, when applied to men who have simply decided, for reasons I am not certain any tactical manual can fully explain, that the war is not yet over for them. I do not know that I ever caught up to that understanding in time to do anything useful with it. I only know that I have not forgotten it since. 8 men walked into a dark tree line on a chaotic December night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. 19 days later, they walked out the other side of a war they had, by any reasonable measure, no business still fighting. That is the whole of the story. That is all it ever was.